Well, if you have a Bible, open it please to Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32, as we continue this series on the life of Jacob, I have simply entitled the series, The Battle with Me. And it deals with the subject of selfishness, something that we all struggle with from time to time. But tonight we're focusing our attention on the story found in chapter 32 of the book of Genesis. And we're not going to take the time to read or to look at chapters 29, 30, or 31. But let me just say this. There is a lot of deceit, a lot of dishonesty all throughout these three chapters. If you read chapters 29, chapter 30, and 31, you will find that it is just covered up with deceit and dishonesty. And when I read chapters 29, 30, and 31, I say to myself, Jacob has finally met his match. He's finally met his match. And the reason I say that is because his uncle Laban was just as dishonest, just as deceitful, and just as self-serving as Jacob was. If I could write a heading over these three chapters, I would put these words: the deceiver himself is deceived. Because we know that Jacob was a deceiver. And here in these chapters that we're not going to take the time to read, we find that his uncle was also a deceiver. And so the deceiver himself, Jacob himself, is deceived by Laban. How ironic that in chapter 31, you may want to glance at it, chapter 31 verse 7, Jacob says, "And your father hath deceived me." Up until this point, it was all about Jacob deceiving other people, but now he himself is being deceived by his uncle Laban. In the 20 years, and that's how long he was there with his uncle Laban, 20 years, he certainly experienced the truth of Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. This is a verse that all of us need to keep in our mind, and also a verse that if you are a parent and you're raising children, you need to remind them of this biblical truth over and over and over again. Here it is: "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." Well, Jacob certainly experienced the truth of Galatians 6 and verse 7 in these three chapters. Let me illustrate. If you remember back in chapter 27, Jacob had lied to his father about being the firstborn. Do you remember that? He dressed up like Esau and even put some extra hair on his arms and around the back of his neck. And he even had the smell of Esau and made the food that Esau would make. You remember all of that? We studied that in Genesis chapter 27. And you find these words in Genesis 27 verse 19. "And Jacob said unto his father, I am Esau, thy firstborn." Now, was he lying? He was lying, wasn't he? And now in chapter 29, Laban lies to Jacob, and instead of giving him his youngest daughter Rachel to marry, because he had worked 7 years. You remember that story? He worked 7 years so he could marry Rachel, and guess what? Laban gives Jacob his firstborn daughter, Leah. It was almost as if God was saying, you're all about being a firstborn. So guess what? You're going to get the firstborn first, Leah. And so, you know the whole story, and we're not even taking the time to read these chapters, but he ends up working another 7 years. And so after 14 years, he has 2 wives. He has Rachel, and he also has Leah. The words of Solomon come to my mind: "But the way of transgressors is hard." The way of transgressors is hard. If we choose the way of sin, if we choose the pathway of deceit and dishonesty, it's going to be a hard road ahead. And that's what Jacob is learning. After 20 years of experiencing Laban's underhanded practices, Jacob's frustration finally boils over in chapter 31, verse 41. Look at it, please, if you will. Chapter 31, verse 41. He confronts his uncle, who is now his father-in-law, with these words. Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. That's once every 2 years. His uncle Laban was just as deceitful and self-serving and dishonest as Jacob was. Well, the day has finally arrived for Jacob and his now rather large family and herds of animals to leave his uncle's homeland. It was time for Jacob to go back home and to deal with the consequences of the past. There's a whole nother message there, but we cannot run from our past forever. Eventually, you have to deal with what we have done in the past. And that's what Jacob is dealing with here in chapter 32 and forward. In time, he would have to meet face to face with his twin brother Esau. And going through Jacob's mind was no doubt the question, would Esau forgive him or would Esau fight him? Which one would it be? Because when he left home 20 years ago, the fear was what? Esau was going to kill him. In fact, he had so convinced Rebekah of that Rebekah said, you need to get out of town. You need to go to my brother's homeland, where I came from. And so here, going through the mind of Jacob is, okay, I know that I need to leave here and I need to go back home, but I wonder whether my twin brother Esau is still angry with me, whether he still wants to kill me, or will he forgive me for my own deceit and my own dishonesty that I practiced on my own brother.